Hey guys, today we're going to talk about France and the United States and their history together. Because even though they can seem very different, the two countries have been close allies for hundreds of years. It all started with one event, an event that nobody expected and that completely changed history forever: the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was a conflict in North America between the British and the French. It began in 1754 and ended in 1763. As part of the larger 7 Years' War, it was fought not only in North America, but also in Europe, India, and the Philippines. But here we will focus on the war in North America, which led to the complete takeover of Canada by the British. During the war, the French allied themselves with various Native American tribes. The British recruited soldiers from their colonies in North America, as well as hired mercenaries. In fact, one of the most famous figures of the war was a mercenary, a German named Friedrich von Steuben, who later became a general in George Washington's army during the American Revolutionary War. Anyway, the war resulted in the capture of many French soldiers by the British. In order to get them out, the French sent a diplomat to Britain to negotiate a treaty. The treaty would end the war and hand over Canada to the British. But there was a problem. The French were suspicious that the British wanted to take more than just Canada from them. So they demanded that an official from the British government accompany the diplomat to London to ensure that nothing else was negotiated behind closed doors. This was unacceptable to the British, so they refused. This meant that no treaty could be signed, and the French had to find another way to get their soldiers back home. So they came up with an ingenious plan. They would send a fleet of ships to the coast of New England and demand the release of French prisoners in exchange for British prisoners in French hands. However, this plan fell through when the British captured one of the French ships and killed or imprisoned everyone on board. Once again, the French were forced to come up with another plan. By now, they had exhausted every option except one. They would ask their former ally, Spain, to intervene and secure the release of their prisoners. Spain was happy to help and agreed to send a fleet of ships to intercept the British and force them to the negotiating table. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. While the French were waiting for Spain to come to their rescue, something incredible happened. The British decided to release the French prisoners without any conditions. The French couldn't believe their luck. They didn't have to wait for Spain anymore. They immediately set off to France to celebrate. But why did the British suddenly change their mind? Well, we may never know for sure, but there are a few theories. The most popular one is that the British simply realized that they did in need French prisoners anymore because they had enough soldiers of their own. Another theory is that the British made a secret deal with the Dutch, who were at war with the Spanish, promising to release Dutch prisoners. If the Spanish stayed out of the conflict in North America, whatever the reason, the British released the French prisoners and the war was finally over. France lost Canada, but gained something much more valuable: a new perspective on the world. You see, ever since Jacques Cartier had arrived in Canada in 1535, France had seen North America as a place full of potential. There were plenty of resources to be exploited, and fur trading was booming. But after the war, the French realized that they couldn't compete with the British. They didn't have the same access to capital or manpower, so they had to find another way to stay relevant. They focused on the areas where they excelled: culture and diplomacy. Under the reign of Louis XV, France became a major player in European affairs. The country went to war against the Dutch over colonial possessions in the Caribbean, and engaged in a struggle for supremacy in Europe with the Austrians and the Spanish. All the while, France continued to expand its colonial empire. In 1763, they acquired Louisiana from Spain, and in 1767, they took possession of the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Despite being thousands of miles away from metropolitan France, these colonies were still very important to the French. That's because they provided a steady flow of wealth and resources back to France. For example, sugar plantations in Louisiana were extremely profitable, and the French were able to use that money to finance their wars in Europe. In the meantime, the United States was going through its own revolution. The 13 colonies in North America declared independence from Britain in 1776 and won their freedom just 8 years later. From the start, the Americans had support from France. They needed France's help to win the war. And in return, they promised to honor any commercial agreement that France might make with them regarding trade and navigation. After the war, France and the United States established diplomatic relations. On February 6, 1778, it was the first official alliance between France and a newly independent nation. This was a significant moment for both countries. France was one of the most powerful nations in Europe, and its alliance with the United States gave the Americans a sense of security. At the same time, France gained a valuable ally in North America, which would help them counter the British. However, this alliance was put to the test just a few years later. When France went to war against the Dutch again, the French were fighting over control of the island of St. Martin, which was located in the Caribbean. The island had been divided between the Dutch and the Spanish since 1648. But France wanted it all to themselves. When the Dutch refused to sell the island, France declared war. The war lasted from 1780 to 1783 and resulted in the recapture of St. Martin by the British. Despite the setback, the Franco-American alliance remained strong. In 1793, France and the United States signed a new treaty which outlined their respective rights and obligations. The treaty also included a secret protocol in which the two countries agreed to settle their disputes peacefully and to consult each other before going to war. In the following decades, France and the United States continued to cooperate on a variety of issues. They worked together to suppress piracy in the Caribbean, to promote trade and industry, and to resolve boundary disputes in North America. The two countries also supported each other during times of crisis. When Napoleon came to power in France, he quickly set about restoring France's position as a major power in Europe. He went to war against Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and emerged victorious. This victory made Napoleon the most powerful ruler in Europe, and he began to look beyond the continent for new conquests. He turned his attention to the United States and began to plot the downfall of their fledgling republic. Napoleon's plan was to provoke a war with the United States, then send his army to conquer the country while its leaders were away fighting. President Thomas Jefferson was well aware of Napoleon's plans, and he took steps to prepare for a possible attack. He increased the size of the U.S. Army and Navy and began to build fortifications along the Atlantic coast. In 1803, Napoleon offered to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States. This was an offer that Jefferson could not refuse. The purchase of Louisiana doubled the size of the United States and gave them control of the Mississippi River and New Orleans. In 1807, Napoleon declared that any nation which went to war with France would be considered an enemy of France. This declaration was aimed at the British, who had been harassing American ships at sea. Napoleon hoped that the United States would declare war on Britain, which would force them to divert some of their troops from the war in Europe. Jefferson refused to go to war and instead imposed economic sanctions on Britain. These sanctions were not very effective, and the British continued to harass American ships. In 1812, Congress declared war on Britain. The war was fought mostly on the Great Lakes and along the Atlantic coast. It ended in 1815 with the Battle of New Orleans. The battle was fought on January 8, 1815, and resulted in a decisive victory for the Americans. The British were forced to retreat, and the United States won its independence from Britain. The close ties between France and the United States helped to ensure that the Franco-American War was not a major conflict. Although there were some military engagements, they were relatively minor and did not result in any significant loss of life. Following the war, France and the United States continued to maintain cordial relations. In fact, in 1824, an agreement was reached to end the practice of impressment, which had been a major source of tension between the two countries. Impressment was the practice of forcing sailors into the British Navy. The British had been doing it for years. It was one of the main reasons for the War of 1812. In the late 19th century, the two countries worked together to resolve several boundary disputes. They also cooperated on a number of commercial ventures, including the construction of the Erie Canal and the development of the St. Lawrence River. During World War I, the United States remained neutral while France was one of the Allied powers. However, in 1917, the United States did declare war on Germany after German U-boats sank 3 American merchant ships. After the war, the United States played an important role in the Paris Peace Conference, which was responsible for ending the war and establishing the Treaty of Versailles. The two countries have maintained close ties ever since. As you can see, the relationship between France and the United States has been a long and complicated one. But despite the ups and downs, the two countries have managed to maintain a close alliance that has lasted for centuries. Alright guys, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, if you want to learn more about France or the United States, I highly encourage you to visit their official websites.